Bertemu kembali dan kita ingin lihat sentimen yang akan pengaruhi pasaran Asia dan juga global pada minggu ini, minggu pertama dagangan pada 2021 bersama dengan penganalisis pasaran FXTM. Han Tan. Han, thank you for joining us. Han, this is the first week of trading for 2021. Tell us about the factors that could affect markets in Asia this week.
Yeah, if you look at it from a news-driven or event-driven perspective, there are some key events coming up that could really trigger some volatility, and I'm sure we'll get into them during the course of this conversation. But I think the one arguably with the widest influence would be the two runoffs out of the state of Georgia. I think that's set to determine the political, or not just the political makeup in Congress, but also the political might that the incoming Biden administration could have to push his agenda through over the next couple of years. And keep in mind that the official results could take a while to be announced a la the November presidential elections. So that could keep us on our toes, not just for this week, but potentially for thereafter as well.
Tell us about this transition process until June or January when President Biden will swear in. What are investors, how are investors looking at this transition process right now? Because I think it's been marred with accusations and also campaigning from the Trump side still. How are investors looking at this?
Yeah, well, when it comes to some of the noise, and I guess I'll use that word, it seems to be political noise out of the Trump camp, right? Although obviously what transpires out of the two Senate runoffs out of Georgia, I think that has more a more material impact on market sentiment. Because keep in mind, markets are in two minds right now. Because on one hand, if you do see this decidedly democratic tint within the chambers of Congress, for the short term, it implies that there could be more U.S. fiscal stimulus coming through the pipeline, and that is supportive of stock markets around the world. However, given the traditional platform that Democrats employ, that being higher regulation and potentially higher corporate taxes, investors are having to digest that as well. So, I mean, a long story short, they being investors had reveled in the prospects of a gridlocked market, a gridlocked U.S. government. But if that gridlock is then perhaps upended by the results of the Senate runoffs out of Georgia, that could really change the math over the outlook for U.S. stock markets.
You mentioned the stimulus package or the fiscal package that was announced last week. What are some of the spillover sentiments from 2020 that we can expect to continue from 2020 into 2021? Could it be the stimulus package or even Brexit?
Yeah, well, I think the fiscal stimulus has been priced in, at least what has been tabled before the new year, the $600 checks to U.S. households. Brexit, we really don't see it rearing its head anytime soon again. However, it is an underlying risk, because keep in mind the trade deal between the UK and EU that was secured on Christmas Eve includes a review clause. So at any time, if either the UK or EU don't like what they're seeing in this post-Brexit era, they could come back to the table and perhaps really destabilize market risk sentiment. But I think the bigger theme, or the spillover, that's the word you use there, would be the pandemic, okay? Because we are not out of the woods yet. It is still something that global investors have to contend with. Given the optimism that we've seen over the past couple of months, it's imperative that the vaccines roll out around the world. That is not disrupted. It's imperative that the global economy continues to recover, because if we see that storyline being disrupted, we could see some pullbacks in some of these riskier asset classes.
And Han, let's talk about the key indices in the US. They closed at a record high on Friday. Can we expect this rally to continue this week?
Well, actually, right now, looking at the futures market, we are seeing a slight dip. We'll see if it holds when Europe and U.S. markets open as well. But I think overall, there's bound to be some caution leading up to the Senate runoffs out of Georgia, right? Like we mentioned earlier, because even if you look at how the U.S. indices performed in the 2 weeks or so in the lead up to the November elections, there was some profit taking as well. But I think looking at the year as a whole, I think the base case for 2021 is that we expect more upside for U.S. equities, given the ultra accommodative policies that not just the Fed but major central bankers around the world are employing. You've, like we mentioned earlier, potentially more fiscal stimulus in the pipeline. And so that really bodes well for this risk-on narrative in the markets as we look ahead to the rest of the year.
And what are the top 3 trends do you foresee this week? Because I think we know that some key numbers will be out this week. We have the China's Caixin PMI today. Sunday for non-manufacturing was up to 55.7%. US manufacturing PMI, OPEC meeting in the US crude stock. Many more numbers are expected today and also this week. What is that magic number that investors look forward to and the top 3 trends for this week in Asia?
Yeah, I think keep in mind some of these economic prints that you mentioned earlier, these are backward looking, right? Whereas the overall narrative in the markets is that investors are already pricing in the recovery that can be enabled by the vaccine. So they are forward looking in nature. So, having said that, I think when we, as we pay attention to these data that's coming out, for the fundamentally driven investor, they want to ensure that they get more evidence of that global economic recovery, right? So what it means is that the manufacturing PMI numbers, for example, that you mentioned, they have to stay above 50. And to be fair, the manufacturing PMI is out of the US and China. They have been staying above 50 throughout the second half of 2020. Now, 50 is important because it marks that conditions in the sector are expanding, right? Now, as for the oil markets, I think that OPEC plus decision today, and that's something we haven't really talked about yet. I think that is absolutely crucial, at least for the near-term trajectory for oil prices, because it really remains to be seen how the balance of power manifests itself at the outcome of this meeting, and keeping in mind what they signal about the global demand outlook, because some of the tones out of the GMMC committee, I think yesterday, they were still pointing to some downside risks to the global the global demand outlook. So I think there's a bit of caution that's being reflected in oil prices right now as we wait for that OPEC plus decision about whether or not to increase supplies for February.
And Han, this is the first week of 2021. We have seen how 2020 unfolded. Do you think investors are maybe a bit cautious still? COVID-19 numbers are still rising, as you mentioned earlier. What are the things that keep investors up at night?
Yeah, I mean, and you're right to point out that there is this sense of caution in the market as a result. But I think the story from 2020, and this is the big lesson that we took from last year, is that markets, or equity markets in particular, have been willing to ignore the present economic realities and actually price in the hope, the optimism of what the world would look like as we move into this post-pandemic era. So we expect that kind of mindset to persist. I mean, of course, it is a very fluid situation. So I think investors have to remain vigilant as they continue to monitor some of these downside risks. And it's not just OPEC Plus who has to monitor these downside risks. I think investors have to play their role as well.
Thank you very much, Han Tan, penganalisis pasaran FXTM bersama kita membincangkan berkenaan dengan sentimen pasaran mingguan pada minggu ini untuk pasaran global. Terima kasih, Han Tan. Dan seterusnya, indeks pembelian pengurus China dicatatkan pada 55.7% pada Disember. Ini adalah 0.7% lebih rendah daripada dicatatkan pada November dalam kenyataan yang dikeluarkan China pada Ahad. Ini adalah bulan kelima berturut-turut indeks ini dicatatkan pada atas 55%. Sebarang angka di atas 50% menandakan pengembangan dan di bawah penguncupan. Dalam kenyataannya, China lapor indeks ini tunjukkan pengembangan ekonomi yang sedikit perlahan namun kekal stabil. Pengembangan dicatatkan dalam aktiviti penerbangan, telekomunikasi, penyiaran dan juga kewangan. Tambahnya sektor pembinaan catat pertumbuhan yang pantas. Ini menurutnya adalah kesan daripada pelaburan aset tetap ke atas pemulihan di China. Dan paparan itu mengakhiri Niaga Awani untuk pagi ini. Teruskan bersama kami di Astro Awani. Perkembangan lanjut berkenaan dengan banjir di beberapa negeri di Malaysia dan juga perkembangan luar negara. Saya Riza Zulkapli. Salam hormat.